The room was already dark when the screen lit up. 75 inches of it, bright, unforgiving. I heard my name before I understood what I was looking at. Laughter followed, controlled at first, then spreading in small, polite waves. My parents were standing beside the screen. Calm, certain, like they had prepared this. Photos, messages. A version of me I didn't recognize, but everyone else seemed to accept instantly. I didn't speak. I didn't move. Because the worst part was not the lies. It was how easily people believed them. And somewhere behind me, my grandmother shifted in her chair, the only person in the room who hadn't laughed. I grew up in a house where silence was a kind of discipline. Not enforced directly, no one ever told me not to speak, but it was understood. Words in our home were measured. Reactions were controlled. Emotion, if it existed, stayed contained within private spaces that no one else acknowledged. My parents believed in presentation. Not in a superficial way, but in something more precise. Order, structure, reputation. Everything had a place, including me. I learned early what my place was. I was the one who did not argue, the one who did not interrupt, the one who listened carefully and responded only when necessary. It wasn't that I was ignored. I was acknowledged, politely, consistently, but never in a way that invited attention. And for a long time, I thought that meant I was trusted. Our days followed a pattern that rarely changed. My father handled everything external: business, relationships, decisions that extended beyond the house. People respected him without hesitation. They spoke to him with a certain careful tone, as if aware that he did not tolerate inefficiency or contradiction. My mother managed everything inside. Not just the house, but the way it appeared to others. She noticed details no one else did, how something was said, how it was perceived, what it suggested. Nothing escaped her attention and nothing remained unshaped. Together, they created an environment where nothing seemed uncertain. I moved within that environment carefully, not out of fear but out of habit. I understood the expectations without needing them explained. Be reliable, be consistent, do not complicate things. And I didn't. If something bothered me, I adjusted. If something felt unclear, I assumed I was missing context. I rarely asked questions that might disrupt the flow of things. It wasn't suppression, it felt like alignment. Like I was doing what was expected of me, and in return, everything remained stable. That stability mattered. People outside the family often commented on it. They described us as composed, well-structured, respectable. There was a quiet admiration in the way others spoke about my parents and, by extension, about us. I never questioned that perception. Why would I? Inside the house, everything functioned. There were no raised voices, no visible conflicts. Disagreements, if they happened, were handled privately and resolved quickly. Nothing lingered long enough to become visible, and I believed that meant everything was fine. My grandmother lived with us, though with us was a technical detail more than anything else. She occupied a space that felt separate, even when she was in the same room. Not excluded, exactly. She was always present during meals, during gatherings, but her presence was quiet in a different way. Where my silence came from adaptation, hers felt like observation. She watched things, not obviously, not in a way that drew attention, but there were moments, small, easily missed, where I would notice her looking at something just a second longer than everyone else. A pause that didn't interrupt anything, but didn't quite belong either. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. And even then, her responses were brief, careful, almost as if she was choosing not to say more rather than having nothing to add. My parents treated her with respect, but it was a contained respect. Predictable, structured, like everything else. I never thought much about it. At the time, it all felt normal. There was comfort in knowing what was expected, in knowing how to behave, how to respond, how to move through each day without friction. I didn't feel restricted. I felt steady. If anything, I saw myself as fortunate. There were no sudden changes, no instability, no uncertainty about where I stood in the family. My role was clear and I fulfilled it without resistance. And in return, I was included. Trusted, I thought. Even when small things didn't quite align, when a detail felt slightly off or a conversation ended too quickly, I dismissed it without effort. Not because I was ignoring something important, but because it didn't seem important enough to question. Everything, after all, was consistent. That was the word I would have used if someone had asked me to describe my life then. Consistent, predictable, secure. I didn't realize that consistency can also be constructed. That predictability can be maintained. That security, when it depends entirely on someone else's version of events, is not the same as truth. At the time, none of that occurred to me. At the time, I trusted them. Completely. The first change was small enough to ignore. I only noticed it because it repeated. A conversation would stop when I entered the room, not abruptly, not in a way that felt obvious, but with a soft shift. A pause. Then a different topic, introduced too smoothly to feel natural. At first, I assumed timing. I had walked in at the wrong moment. It happens. But then it happened again. And again. I began to recognize the pattern not through what I heard, but through what I didn't. The missing parts of conversations. The fragments that never reached me. It wasn't exclusion in a direct sense. No one told me to leave. No one refused to answer when I spoke. But there was a subtle repositioning of space, as if I had stepped into something that was not meant to include me. I adjusted the only way I knew how. I entered rooms more quietly. I spoke less. I waited longer before asking questions. Still, the pattern remained. My mother started taking calls in a different room. That, by itself, meant nothing. But she had never done that before. She used to answer everything openly, even discussing details while I was nearby. Now, her voice lowered when I passed by. Once, I paused outside the door, not intentionally, just long enough to catch a few words before she noticed me. "It's better if she doesn't." The rest was lost when the door clicked shut. Later, when she came back, her expression was unchanged, composed, exact. She asked me a question about something routine, something ordinary, and I answered without hesitation. There was no indication that anything had been interrupted, so I let it go. My father became more precise in the way he spoke about me. Not colder, not distant, just measured. If someone asked about me in his presence, his answers felt slightly rehearsed. Still accurate, but lacking the small, natural variations that used to exist. He chose his words more carefully, as if each one served a purpose beyond the immediate conversation. I noticed it once during a dinner with guests. "She's always been very independent," he said. There was a slight pause before the word. Independent, it wasn't wrong. But it wasn't the word he used before. No one reacted to it. The conversation continued. The word settled into the room without resistance. I didn't correct it. There was nothing to correct, but I remembered it. Moments like that began to collect, small, separate, individually meaningless. Together, they formed something I couldn't define. I started paying attention without meaning to. Not in an active way, I wasn't searching for anything, but my awareness shifted. I noticed tone more than content, timing more than words. The way certain things aligned too neatly or didn't align at all. And with that awareness came a quiet discomfort. Not fear, not suspicion, just unease. Like standing in a room where the temperature has changed slightly, but no one else seems to feel it. I considered asking about it. More than once, I thought about bringing up something small. A single moment. A simple question, but every version of that conversation ended the same way in my mind. I would be told I misunderstood. Not harshly. Not dismissively in an obvious way, just gently corrected, reframed. And I would accept it, because that was what I had always done. So instead of asking, I adjusted again. I became more careful with my own words, more deliberate in how I presented things. I avoided ambiguity, avoided anything that could be misinterpreted. If something felt unclear, I clarified it immediately, before it had the chance to shift. It gave me a sense of control, even if it was small. My grandmother noticed the change before anyone else did, not through anything I said, but through what I didn't. One afternoon, she asked me a question while we were sitting together, something simple, routine. I answered it directly. She watched me for a moment longer than necessary. "You're thinking more," she said. It wasn't a question. I didn't respond right away. There was no reason to deny it, but acknowledging it felt unnecessary. After a few seconds, I nodded. She didn't ask what I was thinking about. She didn't offer advice. She simply looked away as if that was enough. That was how she always was. Observing without interfering. I found myself wondering briefly if she saw the same things I did. If the pauses, the shifts, the careful language, if any of it stood out to her. But I didn't ask, because asking would make it real. And at that point, it still felt like something that could be explained, something temporary, something I could adjust to the way I always had. So I stayed quiet, and the discomfort stayed with me. The first time I realized something was wrong, it wasn't because of what was said. It was because of what was repeated. A story I had heard once, casually mentioned, almost forgettable, came back again a few days later, this time in front of someone else. The structure was the same, the tone unchanged, but the details had shifted slightly. Not enough to challenge, just enough to reshape. I noticed it immediately. "She forgot to follow through," my mother said, her voice calm, almost neutral. "It's not unusual. She tends to get distracted." I didn't react. The situation she was referring to existed. That part was true. But the way it was being described was different. Incomplete. I hadn't forgotten. The timeline had changed. The responsibility had shifted just slightly in a way that made the outcome appear like my fault. No one questioned it. Why would they? The version she presented made sense. It was clean, easy to accept, and I said nothing. Because correcting it would have required explaining everything else. The context, the sequence, the parts that didn't fit neatly into a short explanation. And I already knew how that would go. I would sound defensive. The conversation would shift away from facts and toward tone. And eventually I would be told that it wasn't that serious. So I let it pass. But I remembered it. After that, I started noticing how often it happened. Not just with my mother, but with my father as well. He didn't alter stories as obviously. His approach was more precise. He selected details carefully, presenting only what supported a certain impression. "She prefers to work independently," he said once, during a conversation I wasn't directly part of. Again, not wrong, but incomplete. It suggested distance where there wasn't any. It implied a choice that I hadn't made. I realized then that accuracy wasn't the goal. Consistency was. A consistent version of me, presented across different conversations, reinforced over time. And I had never been part of constructing it. At first, I tried to track it mentally. Small corrections, internal notes of what was true and what had been adjusted. But the more I paid attention, the more patterns I saw. Details were never changed drastically. That would have been noticeable. Instead, they were aligned. Each version slightly adjusted to support the same underlying narrative. Irresponsible, but not overtly. Independent, but in a way that suggested detachment. Capable, but unreliable. It was subtle enough that no single statement stood out. But together they formed something cohesive, something intentional. I started testing it, carefully. In one conversation, I clarified a small detail, nothing confrontational, just a simple correction, stated calmly. "That wasn't exactly what happened," I said. "The deadline was moved before I submitted it." There was a brief pause. My mother smiled, the expression soft but controlled. "Yes," she said, "but the point still stands." The point, not the accuracy. The point, the conversation moved on. No one pressed further, no one asked for clarification. The correction dissolved without impact. That was the moment I understood that facts were not the issue. Perception was, and perception had already been shaped. After that, I became more cautious. Not in what I said, but in when I said it. Timing mattered more than content. There were moments where speaking would only reinforce what had already been suggested, where silence, at least, avoided adding to it. So I chose silence more often, not because I agreed, but because I was beginning to understand the structure I was inside. My grandmother's questions became more specific around that time, still indirect, still controlled, but different. "Do people listen when you correct them?" she asked once without looking at me. It wasn't casual. I considered the question carefully before answering. "No," I said. She nodded slightly as if confirming something to herself. "And do you keep trying?" I hesitated. There was no benefit in answering incorrectly. "No," I said again, another small nod. That was the entire conversation. But it stayed with me longer than anything else, because it framed something I hadn't fully articulated yet. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't misunderstanding. It was a system. And I was the only one not participating in it. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a kind of stillness, a shift in how I processed everything that followed. I stopped assuming that things would correct themselves. I stopped expecting clarity to emerge naturally. Instead, I watched, more carefully than before, because the red flags were no longer isolated. They were connected. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it, even if I still didn't understand why it was happening. Or how far it would go. I did not confront them all at once. It started with one conversation. Carefully chosen, controlled. I waited until the timing felt neutral, no guests, no external pressure, nothing that could shift the focus away from what I was saying. My mother was in the sitting room, my father nearby reading. The environment was calm, predictable. I sat down across from them. "There's something I want to clarify," I said. Even then, I chose the word carefully. Clarify. Not question, not challenge. My mother looked at me first, attentive but not concerned. "What is it?" she asked. "There have been a few situations," I continued, keeping my tone even, "where the way things were described didn't fully match what actually happened." I paused, giving space for that to settle. "I just want to make sure we're all understanding the same version." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, not tense, just measured. My father lowered the paper slightly, his expression unchanged. My mother smiled faintly. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said. The words were simple, the tone neutral, but something about it felt rehearsed. I expected that, so I gave an example, a small one, specific, difficult to dismiss. I explained the situation clearly, outlining the sequence of events, the timing, the detail that had been altered. I kept it factual. No emotion, no accusation. When I finished, I waited. My mother listened without interrupting. When I was done, she nodded once. "I remember that differently," she said. There was no hesitation, no attempt to reconcile the difference, just a quiet contradiction. "I don't think the timeline was as clear as you're describing." I felt the shift immediately, not in what she said, but in how it redirected everything. It wasn't about the event anymore. It was about my interpretation of it. "I'm certain about the sequence," I said, still calm. "There were messages that confirmed," she interrupted gently. "You tend to focus on details," she said. "Sometimes too much." My father spoke then. "Memory isn't always precise," he added. "It's easy to fill in gaps without realizing it." There it was, not denial, not directly, reframing. The conversation moved away from what happened and toward how I perceived what happened. I stayed still. "I'm not guessing," I said. "I checked." Another pause. My mother's expression softened slightly, but not in a reassuring way. "In that case," she said, "it might be worth asking why this matters so much to you." The question was calm, reasonable, but it changed the position entirely. Now I wasn't clarifying facts. I was justifying my concern. I recognized it, but I didn't push against it. "It matters because it's not accurate," I said. My father folded the paper completely now, giving me his full attention. "You're taking this very seriously," he said, again not wrong, but not relevant. "I'm just trying to understand," I replied. "And we're telling you how we remember it," my mother said. Her tone remained steady, controlled. "There's no need to turn this into something bigger than it is." Something bigger. I stopped speaking for a moment, because I could feel the structure forming around me. Every response redirected the conversation away from the original point. Accuracy became perspective. Perspective became emotion. Emotion became overreaction, and overreaction became the issue, not the inconsistency, not the pattern. I tried once more. "There have been multiple situations like this," I said, "not just one." My mother's expression changed slightly then, not visibly to anyone else, but I saw it. A shift from patience to something firmer. "You're starting to sound confused," she said. The word settled quietly in the room, confused. Not wrong, not mistaken, confused. It implied something deeper, something less stable. "I'm not confused," I said, still evenly. "Then what is it?" my father asked. The question was direct but not confrontational. It sounded like an invitation, but I understood it was, because there was no answer that would remain within the original frame. Anything I said would be interpreted through what had already been established. I felt it then, the imbalance, not loud, not aggressive, but complete, two versions of reality. And only one of them supported by the authority of the room. I looked at both of them, calm, certain, unmoved, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't memory. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was controlled, every response, every shift, deliberate. I didn't say that. I didn't react. Instead, I nodded once. "Maybe I'm overthinking it," I said. My mother relaxed immediately. My father leaned back slightly, tension dissolving. "Yes," he said, "that's more likely." The conversation ended there, not resolved, closed. And for the first time, I understood that speaking would not correct anything. It would only give them more to reshape. So I stopped. Not because I believed them, but because I understood the cost of continuing, and how easily it could be turned against me. After that conversation, I stopped trying to correct anything out loud. Not because the inconsistencies had disappeared, but because I understood that speaking was no longer a way to clarify, it was a way to be repositioned. So I adjusted. Externally, nothing changed. I followed the same routines, responded the same way, maintained the same composure they expected. Internally, I started paying attention differently, not to what they said in front of me, but to what existed beyond their version. The first piece came quietly. It wasn't something I was looking for. I came across it while searching for something unrelated, an old message thread buried under months of routine communication. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Then I noticed the date. It aligned with one of the situations my mother had described differently. I read it carefully. Once, then again. The sequence was clear, time-stamped, unambiguous. What had been presented as my delay, my failure to follow through, was not accurate. The change had come from her. The instruction had been modified after I had already completed what was originally asked. I didn't feel surprised, just still. I didn't confront her with it. Instead, I closed the thread and moved on, not because it didn't matter, but because I understood that one piece of evidence wouldn't change anything. Not in that environment. It needed context, pattern, weight. So I continued observing. Over the next few days, I noticed more moments where things didn't align. Conversations that felt slightly off, statements that didn't match what I knew to be true. This time, instead of dismissing them, I tracked them quietly. Mentally at first, then more deliberately. I began revisiting past interactions, not emotionally but structurally, reconstructing timelines, comparing what was said with what actually happened. It was slow work, careful, and with each small confirmation, the shape of it became clearer. This wasn't random, it was consistent. A narrative built over time, supported by selective details and quiet omissions. I wasn't being misrepresented in obvious ways. I was being adjusted, refined into something that could be managed more easily. That realization settled heavily, but it didn't overwhelm me. If anything, it made things quieter, simpler. Because once something becomes clear, it stops being confusing. It becomes measurable. My grandmother was the only one who seemed to notice the shift in me. Not in what I still said very little, but in how I moved through things, more precise, more aware. One afternoon, she asked me to bring her something from the study. It was an ordinary request, but when I returned, she was holding a small stack of papers I hadn't seen before. She didn't hand them to me immediately. Instead, she placed them on the table between us. "Look at these when you have time," she said. Her tone was neutral. I didn't ask what they were. I nodded, took them, and left. Later in my room, I went through them carefully. They weren't dramatic. No single document revealed anything definitive, but together they showed something important. Dates, records, small inconsistencies between what had been officially noted and what had been described verbally. In one case, a decision attributed to me had been documented as coming from someone else. In another, a timeline had been adjusted, subtly, but enough to shift responsibility. It wasn't enough to confront anyone, but it confirmed something I could no longer deny. There were systems involved, not just conversations, not just memory, records. That changed everything, because records don't rely on perception. They exist independently of how they are presented. And if those records didn't align with the narrative being repeated, then the narrative was not simply a misunderstanding. It was constructed. I didn't ask my grandmother where she got the documents. I didn't thank her. There was an understanding in the silence. She was not intervening. She was allowing me to see, that was all. From that point on, I stopped trying to understand why, and started focusing on what existed, what could be verified, what could not be altered through conversation alone. I became more deliberate in how I engaged with everything. I responded when necessary, but I didn't offer more than required. I listened more than I spoke. And when something felt off, I didn't question it out loud. I traced it, quietly, carefully. The full picture wasn't visible yet. There were still gaps, still pieces I couldn't connect, but the direction was clear. And for the first time, I understood that this wasn't something that would resolve itself. It would continue, unless something interrupted it. I didn't know what that interruption would look like, but I knew one thing: if it came, it wouldn't come from conversation. And it wouldn't come from me reacting. It would come from something that couldn't be reframed, something that didn't rely on belief, something that could stand on its own. I folded the papers and placed them back where I found them, not hidden, not displayed, just present, like everything else I was beginning to see. Quiet, but undeniable. The invitation didn't feel unusual when it first arrived. It was framed the way everything in our family was framed: formal, structured, intentional. A gathering carefully planned, a reason to bring people together under the appearance of something ordinary. My mother mentioned it casually at dinner. "We're hosting next week," she said. "A few close people, nothing excessive." I nodded. There was no reason to question it. We hosted often enough. It fit the pattern, predictable, controlled. But as the days passed, the details began to shift. The guest list expanded, not dramatically, but enough to change the nature of the event. People who didn't usually overlap were now being invited into the same space. Professional acquaintances, social connections, individuals whose presence carried weight in different contexts. My father adjusted his schedule more than usual that week. My mother became more precise, not stressed, not overwhelmed, focused. There was a level of attention to detail that went beyond what was necessary for a simple gathering. Timing, placement, sequence, everything was considered. I noticed it. I didn't comment, because by then I understood that noticing something did not mean it would be acknowledged, and asking would only give them an opportunity to define it first. So I watched, quietly. My role remained unchanged. I was expected to be present, composed, and unobtrusive, to participate without drawing attention, to align with the structure that had already been set, and I did. Outwardly, nothing about my behavior shifted, but internally I stopped assuming that the event was neutral. There was a purpose behind it. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could feel it. In the way conversations were handled leading up to it, in the way my name came up more frequently, subtly, indirectly, but with a consistency that hadn't been there before. "She's been managing things on her own," my father said to someone on the phone one evening. "She prefers it that way." Again, not entirely false, but placed within a context I wasn't part of. My mother began referencing past situations more often, not in conversations with me, but around me, small remarks presented as observations. "Sometimes independence comes with a cost," she said once while speaking to a guest. The guest nodded, not fully understanding, but the statement remained, unchallenged. I recognized the pattern immediately: reinforcement. The narrative I had been quietly tracking was no longer contained to private conversations. It was being prepared for a wider audience. That realization didn't create panic. It created clarity, because it confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. This wasn't spontaneous. It was coordinated. The days leading up to the event became more structured, more deliberate. My interactions with my parents remained controlled, almost rehearsed in their normalcy. There were no direct conflicts, no visible tension. If anything, they were more composed than usual, more aligned. Which in itself was unusual. My grandmother's behavior changed as well, not in obvious ways, but she was more present. Where she would normally remain in the background, she now moved through shared spaces more frequently. Sitting longer during meals, observing more directly. She didn't speak about it. She didn't ask me anything. But there was an awareness in her silence that hadn't been there before, like she already knew what was coming, and was waiting. The day of the event arrived without announcement. It was simply there. The house prepared, everything in place. Guests began to arrive in steady intervals, each one greeted with the same controlled warmth my parents always displayed. I remained consistent, polite, measured, present. Nothing about my demeanor suggested anything had changed, and yet the atmosphere felt different, not tense, not uncomfortable, but anticipatory, as if something had been set in motion and everyone was moving toward it without realizing. Conversations overlapped. Small groups formed and shifted. The rhythm of the evening developed naturally, or at least it appeared that way, but underneath it there was structure, timing. My father moved through the room with purpose, engaging where necessary, positioning himself strategically. My mother controlled the flow, subtle redirections, gentle transitions, ensuring that everything progressed without disruption. I noticed how often their attention returned to me, not directly, but consistently, checking, measuring, as if confirming that I remained within the expected parameters, and I did. I gave them no reason to adjust anything, because by then I understood something important. Whatever they had prepared, whatever this event was leading toward, it relied on a version of me, a version they had been building. If I stepped outside of that version too early, it would change the structure, not stop it, just shift it. And I wasn't ready for that, not yet. So I remained exactly what they expected. Quiet. Composed, unquestioning, even as the environment around me tightened, even as the pattern I had been observing moved closer to something visible. I didn't react, because reaction would only give them more to use, more to shape. Instead, I waited, not passively, but deliberately, for the moment when whatever they had constructed would reveal itself fully. And when it did, it wouldn't be through conversation. It would be through something they believed was controlled, something they believed could not be challenged. I didn't know exactly what that would be, but I knew it was coming. And I knew one more thing: I wouldn't stop it, because whatever happened next needed to happen completely. The room didn't quiet all at once. It happened gradually. Conversations softened. Movements slowed. Attention began to gather without being directly called. I noticed it before I understood why. My father stepped forward slightly, positioning himself near the center of the room. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that suggested something was about to begin. My mother stood beside him, composed, certain. There was no announcement, no formal signal, just a shift. And then the screen turned on, 75 inches of light cutting cleanly through the room. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they were told not to, but because the screen gave them something to focus on, something immediate, something defined. I didn't move. I already knew this was the moment. What I didn't know, what I hadn't fully allowed myself to anticipate, was the scale. Images appeared first, familiar but not in the way they should have been. Fragments of moments I recognized, arranged in a sequence I did not. Context removed, timing adjusted. Each image placed next to another in a way that suggested continuity where none existed. Then came the messages, selected, edited, presented without the surrounding conversation that gave them meaning. I read them as they appeared, not quickly, not defensively, just steadily. I recognized every word, and I recognized what was missing. Around me, the room responded in controlled ways, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged between two people, a quiet reaction contained but visible. No one interrupted, no one questioned, because what they were seeing made sense. It had been built to make sense. My mother spoke then, her voice calm, measured, as if explaining something that required clarity. "We felt it was important to address this openly," she said. Address. Not accuse, not expose, address. My father added context where needed, short statements, controlled explanations, each one reinforcing the structure already on the screen. I listened, not to respond, but to understand how complete it was. Every piece aligned, every detail supported the same conclusion: irresponsible, unreliable, detached. The version of me they had been constructing quietly, consistently, was now visible. And it held, because nothing on that screen was entirely false. That was the precision of it. Truth arranged without balance becomes something else. I felt the weight of it settle across the room, not as hostility, but as acceptance. This is who she is. No one said it, they didn't need to. I could see it in how they looked at me now. Not with confusion, not with doubt, with understanding. A complete, incorrect understanding. And still I didn't speak. Because I understood something in that moment with absolute clarity. If I responded emotionally, if I tried to correct, to explain, to defend, I would become exactly what they had presented. Reactive, unstable, confirming, so I remained still. Not passive, not defeated, just controlled. The screen continued. More examples, more evidence. Each one carefully selected. Each one incomplete in the same way. I felt no urgency to interrupt it. No need to stop it early. Because stopping it would not undo what had already been shown. It would only prevent it from reaching its full shape. And I needed to see that shape completely. Only then would it matter. The final image lingered longer than the others. Then the screen went dark. Silence followed, not heavy, not uncomfortable, just expectant. My mother looked at me, not harshly, not aggressively, but with something close to resolution. "This isn't meant to embarrass you," she said. The statement settled without resistance. "It's meant to clarify things." Clarify. Again, I met her gaze briefly. Then I looked away because there was nothing to say that wouldn't serve the structure already in place. The room waited, not for a reaction exactly, but for confirmation, for alignment. For me to respond in a way that made everything they had shown feel complete. I didn't give them that. I remained exactly as I had been, quiet, composed, unmoved. And in that stillness, something shifted, not in the room, but just behind me. A chair moved slightly. A small sound, barely noticeable, but enough. My grandmother stood, slowly, deliberately, no urgency. No emotion visible on her face. She did not look at me, she looked at them. And for the first time that evening, something existed in the room that had not been accounted for. Not a reaction, not a defense, something else. Something they had not prepared for. She stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly. And then she spoke. Not loudly. Not forcefully, but in a way that did not allow interruption. "If we are clarifying things," she said, "then we should do it completely." The room didn't react immediately, because the tone didn't invite reaction. It invited attention. My parents didn't respond right away. For the first time that evening, they paused. And in that pause, the structure they had built held, but not as firmly as it had a moment before, because something had entered it, something they did not control. And I understood, without turning around, this was the point where everything would change. Not through me, but through something they could not reshape. Not this time. No one interrupted her. That was the first shift. Not visible in expression, not spoken aloud, but present. The kind of silence that isn't passive, but waiting. My grandmother did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She stepped closer to the table where a few documents had already been placed earlier in the evening, materials that had seemed irrelevant at the time. Decorative almost, something to accompany the gathering. Now they had context. She rested her hand lightly on them, not claiming attention, just anchoring it. "If we are going to present things publicly," she said, "then we should rely on complete records." My father moved first, not abruptly, not defensively, but with a controlled intention to reestablish direction. "I think this has already been made clear," he said. "There's no need to complicate it." Complicate. The word echoed the same pattern I had heard before. Simplify the narrative, remove what doesn't support it. My grandmother didn't respond to him immediately. Instead, she lifted one of the documents and handed it not to me but to him. "Read this," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't framed as one. The room shifted slightly again. Because this was different. This was not interpretation. This was instruction. My father hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to register. Then he took the paper. He glanced at it first, scanning. I watched his expression, not for emotion, but for change. It came quietly, a slight tightening around his eyes, a pause that extended just a moment longer than necessary. My mother noticed it too. "What is it?" she asked, her tone still composed. He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he read, out loud, not everything, just enough, a message, a date, a timestamp that aligned precisely with one of the situations presented earlier on the screen. But this time, the sequence was intact. The instruction had changed after my involvement. The responsibility had shifted, not toward me, away from me. The room absorbed it slowly, no immediate reaction, but something adjusted. My mother stepped in. "That doesn't change the overall pattern," she said. "One detail doesn't." "There are more," my grandmother said. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't allow the interruption to continue either. She placed another document on the table, then another. each one aligned with something that had been shown on the screen, each one filling in what had been removed. Context, continuity, completion. "This one as well," she said, indicating the next. Again, my father read. This time, there was no attempt to summarize, no selective phrasing. Because the document did not allow it, it was structured, formal, recorded. A decision previously attributed to me clearly documented as originating elsewhere. A timeline previously adjusted, shown in full. There was no argument to be made against it, not without rejecting the record entirely. And that in this room would not hold. The atmosphere didn't collapse, it shifted, quietly. People began to reassess, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. I could see it in the way their posture changed, the way their attention moved back and forth, recalibrating. My mother remained composed, but her responses became less immediate, more measured, as if she was recalculating in real time. "These are selective as well," she said. They represent what was omitted," my grandmother replied. A pause followed. Longer this time, because there was no easy redirection. No reframing that could dismiss multiple, consistent records without drawing attention to the attempt itself. My father set the last document down. Carefully, deliberately. He didn't look at me, he looked at the table, at the papers, at the structure that had begun to fracture. "This wasn't the intention," he said finally. The statement was controlled. But it carried something new, not admission, not apology, but distance. From what had just occurred, my grandmother didn't respond to that. She didn't need to. The documents remained where they were, visible, accessible, unavoidable. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence the room completed its shift, not toward me, but away from certainty. That was the consequence, not outrage, not confrontation, just doubt. Placed exactly where certainty had been, I remained where I was. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. And now there was nothing left for me to add, because the outcome was already unfolding, without me. The narrative they had built didn't disappear, but it no longer held its shape. It no longer stood without question. And that was enough, more than enough, because what replaced it wasn't another version. It was absence, uncertainty. A space where something had been presented as complete and was now understood as incomplete. My grandmother stepped back, returning to her place without ceremony, without acknowledgement, her role in it finished. No one stopped her. No one addressed her directly. Because there was nothing to challenge, nothing to dismiss, only something that had been introduced and could not be removed. I looked at my parents briefly, not with anger, not with expectation, just recognition. They understood not everything, but enough. And in that understanding, something irreversible settled into place. Quiet, permanent, unspoken.